All right, all right, all right. We are just going to go ahead and get started. And again, if you did not get a sticker, come find me afterward. I've got lots of stickers to hand out. My name is Sydney Davis Jr., and I am the host of a podcast called Growing Up Fundie, where I speak to people who either grew up within religions or were somehow impacted as an adult or as a child by religion, whether it's Christianity. I speak to people who were members of the Nation of Islam. I speak to people who are now psychologists or historians about religion. And essentially, what I do on my podcast is I talk to people about their experiences and how religion impacted them in their life and just the advice they would give to other people who might also be questioning their beliefs, changing their beliefs, growing or changing in any way. And we just have a good time. We just have a fun conversation. So if you're interested, the podcast is available on pretty much all audio platforms as well as YouTube. But enough about that. I have my esteemed guest, Jasper Hoffman, AJ Ruley, and Chad Harris. So before I get started, I'm just going to allow them to introduce themselves, starting with AJ. Tell us about yourself.
So my name is AJ. I did not grow up Fundie, okay, like my fellow panelists, but I do have quite a story. I grew up in Argentina in a rural area, and by rural I mean rural. Like there was one school, middle school, not even a high school, and one store. There was no church, so I had no experience with church as a child. Um, my mom grew up as a Catholic, but by the time she had me, she had lost her faith. So she called herself a non believer. We didn't really take the atheist label, I guess you could say. But she loved books, especially science books. So I grew up surrounded by walls of books. And when I was around 15, we decided to move to the United States. And again, I had no experience with religion, but we moved into the house of a family who were, I believe they were evangelists. Like I had not much experience, so I don't even recall what, but they were kind of like extremist fundamentalists. We will go to church with them a little bit. Um, then after that, I would say a few years after, I met my now husband, and his family was religious, and that was another of my introductions into religion. I got pregnant when I was in my early 20s, and unfortunately, I found out that my baby was gonna have some severe defects, like heart defect, and potentially one that was not compatible with life. So family started encouraging me to go to church and, God is going to heal your baby. So I did. And we got introduced to the Assembly of God, which is a pretty fundamentalist evangelist church that believes in the Holy Spirit and the Trinity. They also believe in speaking in tongues, which I know the apostate sisters are very familiar with that, which they're probably sitting in the audience somewhere. Um, Also divine healing. And that's what attracted me to it. I was like, God is going to heal my baby. I also had a lot of health issues. I'm deaf. I was losing my vision. I had some genetic conditions. And I really, really, truly wanted to believe that God was going to heal me. Uh, I actually met Dave Warnock earlier, and his speech left me in tears because I deeply felt what he feels like. I suffered with chronic pain. I've been in a wheelchair. I've had probably over 40 different procedures for pain, extremely painful procedures for pain. So I, during that time, I made a lot of deals with God, a lot of prayer, a lot of begging. I will do this if you do this, please, God. You know how that works, right? Um, Unfortunately, none of that worked. None of that worked. But I feel like what I learned from this is that these cults, they take a hold of you at your most vulnerable times, when you're at your lowest, when you need support the most. And they give you that hope, but it's not real. It's not true hope. It's a false hope. In fact, my healing came after I became an atheist, and I'm pretty sure God had nothing to do with that, right? Like, I've come from being on a wheelchair to like standing up today, and like I can stand on my foot. That was very painful before. Thank you. And also, one of the reasons that I got out of religion was my baby that was born with all of these conditions. My child had two open heart surgeries, and my baby is now right over there, my 14-year-old baby. No thanks to God, no thanks to God. Science is thanks to science. So I just want to say to anyone that may still be in there, in this position, you're not weak. The world is not broken. Does this look like a broken world right here? No, it does not, right? So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, AJ. AJ, everybody. Round of applause. There will be time at the end for questions for our guests regarding anything that you hear. I meant to say that. All right. Chad Harris, hit us with it.
Okay, well, I am Chad Harris, and I was born into an independent fundamental Baptist preacher's home. The IFB thought that the Southern Baptists were too liberal. That's how into it we were. When I was about 7 or 8, my mom's OBGYN convinced her to get into the Quiverful movement, which was a movement designed for women to have as many children as possible to send out Christian soldiers into the world. And from there, they joined a cult called the Institute in Basic Life Principles, or IBLP, run by a man named Bill Gothard. It was the same cult that the Duggars of X-Teen Kids and Counting were part of. I was homeschooled in that cult from age 7 until I graduated. And it took a lot of learning as an adult to get out of it, to get out of the brainwashing. I left fundamentalism when I was in my early 20s, and I left Christianity not too long after that in 2016. So ever since then, I've been trying to make it my mission to reach out to people who are still in fundamentalism, to see to the death of IBLP, which they're still around, but slowly they're dying. And also to warn people of the Christian nationalism that I believe has stemmed a lot from organizations like IBLP.
Chad Harris, everybody. Chad Harris. Jasper Hoffman.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jasper Hoffman. I was raised by an atheist mother who converted into Christianity whenever I was 9 years old in 3rd grade. I come from Northern California, where there was a very large homeschool movement in the early 1990s, and I was a product of that. So I went from being raised relatively secular to going into the Fundie. I oftentimes say I brought the fun to the Fundie, and I can put the U in cult. So my family didn't stop there, and they actually went into conservative Mennonite churches. So I was pulled out of public school at the end of 3rd grade, and that was pretty much the end of my formal education. I then was homeschooled, went to Mennonite school through 9th grade, became a member of the Eastern Pennsylvania Mennonite Church, and was denied an education because I was a female, and denied human rights. I left whenever I was 18. I fought to get my GED. I lived in government housing. I was on food stamps. I am a single mom. I worked 4 jobs, and I was determined to let everybody know how hard it is to leave high control, high demand religion. It is incredibly hard, and I made it look good, because if you are the oldest daughter and you grow up in cults, you know it's all about appearances. So it doesn't matter how dysfunctional things are on the inside, as long as it looks good. But in 2018, I decided that I was done living that facade, and I started a podcast called The Plain People's Podcast. And it was the first podcast to ever talk about what it's like to leave the Amish, Mennonite, and Anabaptist churches. Through that, I uncovered the massive amounts of abuse that were happening. And so I'm very well known now for speaking out on abuse that's happening. I go back into the communities. I'm currently an informant for the Bureau of Criminal Investigations and working with Homeland Security. I go back in and work with Amish communities and helping women create safety plans to be able to navigate what it is like staying in high control, high demand religion, because it is hard to leave. So that's a little bit about me.
A few moments ago, there was an exchange I overheard that just really highlighted why I love events like this. You were talking to somebody and you said, "Oh, what kind of Mennonite were you?" And yeah, and I love that we all get together and it's like, "Oh, what flavor? Like what flavor? Were you like the spicy kind or like the not allowed to wear makeup kind? Like what?" And I love that those kind of conversations we can have on this side of these experiences, and I just thought that was really lovely.
I always say that it's like lasagna. All of us that have grown up in cults and high demand, high control, it is pretty much the same ingredients. Everybody has their own family recipe, and it has a little bit of different spice to it.
Yep.
It's the same shit.
And they all agree that women suck. like the one thing they all have in common is like whore, slut. It's like we can't catch a break. And this is when I announce my cult that I'm going to stop. I'm just kidding. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask a question, and the guests are each going to get an independent opportunity to answer the questions. And then at the very end, I'm going to ask you guys what questions you have for our guests. So the first question is, what was your first indication that something wasn't right? And you can go in any order.
So to set the stage, my family were missionaries to the Netherlands and Belgium for my entire teenage years. And when we came back to the States, I had just graduated high school, and my parents thought it was a good idea to go ahead and just kick me out into the world and say, okay, figure it out from here with your homeschooled education. So I ended up working for a church in Natchez, Mississippi as a minister of music. And it was a struggling church. It was a very small congregation, and they had just gone through the death of their longtime pastor. And the pastor they called was a very, very young man. He was very idealistic, full of like this fervor. It was, of course, an IFB church. And within a year of me working for him, his wife left him and filed charges of abuse against him. This actually hit the local paper. He resigned the church, and the church set about trying to find a new pastor. But then a month later, he came back with his wife in tow saying, actually, it was just a big mistake. Everything's okay. I want to be pastor again. And the church bought it. Come to find out, this had actually happened at a previous church he had pastored as well. Same scenario. And my dad, who was, kind of involved at the time, I told him about it, and I said, this just doesn't seem right to me. He said, well, yeah, these things happen sometimes, but it's best not to talk about it because that's his ministry. That's what God would have him do. So even though it's not right, we just let God work it out. And I said, that doesn't sound right. Then after that, I started looking into a lot of other leaders who we followed as a family in fundamentalism. And I found out that a lot of those preachers had charges of abuse in their past, or even worse, charges of molestation or covering it up. And I approached my dad about that too, some of whom were, people that he had studying under. And he said, well, yeah, but you can't verify everything, and it's best to just not talk about it. Then Bill Gothard himself, the leader of IBLP, had charges brought against him by at least 13 women who said that he had molested them while working at his headquarters. And that shattered my whole world, because that wasn't just my beliefs, that was my education. And I approached my dad about it, and I said, Dad, what's up with this? I said, all these people, and now Bill Gothard. I said, something is wrong. He said, well, yeah, things happen, but you can't control it, and you just move on. And I said, Dad, that was the wrong answer. The answer was supposed to be, I didn't know. The fact that you knew and you wouldn't say anything about it, that's wrong. I said, I didn't sign up to hurt people, and people are being hurt. I'm out.
So I had to think about this. There was one moment whenever I was in ninth grade. I went to Mennonite school through ninth grade. They wouldn't let me come back for 10th. But I went into the library, and all of our reading material had to be approved by the ministry, anything that we read. And I'll never forget pulling out an encyclopedia. And we were looking up something for our science project, and the page didn't exist because they glued the pages together. And not only did they glue the pages together, they then took a black Sharpie, permanent marker, and marked out anything. And so I started pulling out encyclopedias and realizing that anything that had to do with biology, psychology, or science was not available for us. And I went home and told my parents, because I'd grown up outside of this at least through 3rd grade and knew that, science existed. And that was like the indicator of like, this is crazy. But to answer the real question of, it took a long time to realize that I wasn't the problem, because these cults make you the problem. And so really it wasn't until people started speaking out collectively through my podcast where I recognized that I wasn't the problem. There was a big problem, and they were putting it all on us so that to deflect from the fact that what they were running was organized crime. So for me, probably 2018 was when I really realized that.
So, as I mentioned, I got into religion when I got pregnant and found out about my baby's heart defect. So, their first heart surgery was when they were 11 weeks old, just a little baby. And we will just sit there and pray over for healing and, guide the doctor's hands. And my baby was still in pain, a lot of pain. And that was painful for me. But I continued to believe and to beg and to hope for a better outcome, for complete healing, for not needing another surgery. In 2020, right during COVID, we found out that my kid needed another heart surgery. And this was a lot later. They were about 8 or 9 years old. And it was brutal. It was torture for both of us, I think. But more so for my kid, because they were so much more aware of everything that was going on. So sitting by their bedside, holding their hands, they were not even able to speak because they were in so much pain from the surgeries. I could not ever bring myself to out loud pray for them. I was like, no, there is something wrong here. There is no benevolent God that will allow this much suffering on a child. I love you, baby. They will not allow this much suffering for a child, because of what? Because it was my fault? Because it was Adam and Eve's fault, right? And this was a time where I started questioning and realizing that all of this was make believe. And the real heroes here were the surgeons and the nurses and everybody that came to support us. And that was the real hero right there, right? And so yeah, that's when I was like, something is wrong, and yeah, I snapped out of it.
One of the things that I hear a lot, as somebody who creates content in this space, and I know you are all involved in content in this space, is that if we're not careful, we make it look very easy to leave these organizations. We make it look easy. We make it look like, oh, all I did was leave and my life is so much better. And so I always try to give people an opportunity to talk about the hard part, the part where you're trying to figure out what the next move looks like. For example, I remember when I first discovered the atheist experience, I turned back to Christianity because my brain went, no, this is what the church warned you about. The church warned you that when you grew up and you went into the real world, they would make it so easy to turn against God. And this is when they warned me that it's actually my job to have the willpower and to have the ability to say no. Like, yes, that looks like fun. Yeah, that makes a little sense. Like, of course the devil makes sense, you know? And so I remember there was like 3 years there where I knew against my better judgment that the thoughts I was having were genuine, legitimate questions, but I was so afraid that that was the devil making a lot of sense, just like they'd always warned me he would. They didn't say, he won't look fun, he'll be ugly and stupid. They said, he'll be your friend, he'll be weekend plans, he'll be music, he'll be movies. And so I say all that to say, tell us a little bit about the unseen parts of how difficult it was for you to decide to leave, or what that took, or anything, any struggle involved in the process of separating yourself. Or maybe it was a really easy decision. Maybe you were like, nah, you know, just so that people can understand that they're not alone when they struggle in this process.
For me, I think one of the hardest parts was, where do I now find the hope, right, that I had before? And we can still find that in community, in the people that come and walk this journey with us as well. Like everybody that I have met so far hasn't had an easy time coming out of religion. Like, I actually haven't met anyone that's been like, oh yeah, it was just like an overnight thing, like one day into the next. No, family alienating you, because you're now a heathen, and but also not just the family that alienates you, but the family that still keeps you close, but that is like, well, I will pray for you. I will pray for your soul. And I will pray for you to go back to religion and to go back to believing in God, right? Because that hurts. That hurts to hear that they want you to not be your authentic self, like who you want to be, and to continue to become free, to become free. So I think that was probably one of the hardest part for me, family and where to find hope. So that's why I appreciate these type of conventions where everybody comes together and everybody understands and everybody's nodding their heads along as you speak. And that's what gives me hope.
So for me, the struggle in leaving was the fact that I really didn't want to. um, I went through the same kind of grieving process I think everybody does when they leave. First of all, I looked around at the problems in fundamentalism, and my first thought was, well, I can fix it. Like, if nothing else, being that deep into the cult taught me you're supposed to be a world changer. Well, change this world. If there's problems, maybe it's up to you to be the superhero and fix everything. But you can't fix systemic corruption by yourself. It takes the right. It takes the system being willing to change, and when the people up top are benefiting, that ain't going to happen. So I started doing therapy. I started seeing a counselor. And of course, she recommended, well, maybe you need to get away from your church and go find other churches. So I went into mainstream Christianity. And at the time, deconstruction wasn't a word that I knew. It was the early 2010s. So I just told myself, I'm just going to take away everything that I believe except for I like Jesus and I love God. Let's see what happens from there. The more I was in mainstream Christianity, though, and I told my story, the more they tried to mitigate it. They were like, well, okay, but what you went through wasn't really a cult, was it? It was just a little high control, people do different things and all that. And then it felt like I was being really, kind of like marginalized, or not marginalized, but like I wasn't being taken seriously when I told my story. And in fact, one of the main pastors who told me that ended up having an affair later. But anyway, surprise, surprise. But then a little bit later, as I was continuing seek therapy, I got to realizing I was like, I'm doing all the work when there is a supposed God of the universe that wants to have a relationship with me. And I can't think of any other relationship in my life where I would settle for doing all the work. Why am I settling for this? So 2016, after the election happened, I was going to church because even though I in my heart really didn't believe at that point, it was something you do because I live in Alabama. I was going to church and it was just gnawing at me. I said, why am I going to sit with people who think I'm the literal devil for how I voted? Why am I going to, go pretend like I believe this thing I don't think I really believe anymore? And just all of a sudden, just something snapped in my head, and I pulled off. I got off a few exits early. I went to a coffee shop that I knew of, and I got a cup of coffee, and I walked across the street to Railroad Park in Birmingham, right in the middle of town. And I sat on a bench, and I literally looked up and I said, I don't know what's out there, but if you really want to talk, I'm here. I have coffee. I have time. After 30 minutes of silence, I said, that's my answer. And I walked away. And it was a long road to get there. And I kicked and screamed the whole way. But and I'm sure I can hear, so many stories from other people. You tried and you tried and you tried. But like Jasper said, you were taught that you were the problem. And I'm here to tell you that, sometimes it's best for your own health and safety to just walk away.
How much time do we have? um, so I never wanted to leave either. And I think that what I've seen from people that leave the Anabaptists is that there's either this, I'm throwing my head covering off, I'm cutting my hair, I'm putting on jeans, and I'm just immersing myself in the culture, and I'm going to figure it out. Or you have people like me that I couldn't stay, but I didn't want to go. And that is a really difficult place to be, especially when you're 18. And they wouldn't let me, because I was from the outside, they would never fully accept me. So I knew that I was never going to be able to have the life with the person that I wanted. And the reality is if you were a single woman, after 21, if you're not married, you're an old maid. You're just trash, pretty much. And the only way to make money is to become a school teacher, essentially, within the community. And the only school teachers that they will put in the schools educating their children are ones that are church approved. But I wasn't church approved to get married to the person that I wanted to. So how was I going to be able to make a living? What was I going to do? Stay in my dysfunctional home with my abusive father? And so I made this decision because I was really forced out. And I went back several times. I kept my head covering on for 2 years. I wore dresses. I went kind of back into the Fundie type of movement. And I was so pious. Oh my God, you should read my journal entries from when I was 19, sitting in the airport praying for all of these people as they're going about their sinful lives. Nobody would be more horrified that I'm sitting up here than me right now. So I knew, though, that the only way that I was going to make it was if I was educated. I knew from when I was little, I wanted to go into horses. That was all I cared about. And I fought and I fought and I fought. And they tried to send me away to a facility and silence me and drug me. And they separated me from every single person. I was isolated for over 2 years. I was so suicidal. I was cutting. I was pulling my hair out. But I knew that I wanted to go into horses. And for me, education was the only thing that I had to go into. But my family was so dysfunctional because you can leave the cult, but you can't leave your family system that takes you in it. And so maybe they leave the cult, but the dysfunction that attracts people to this doesn't go away unless there's a lot of healing, and that takes time. And so I had to then fight my own family unit because I believed in myself, but nobody in my life believed in me. Not one. And you've got to make a decision that you're worth fighting for, which is really hard when you're not allowed to have any sort of identity. So here you are learning who am I? So you literally, it's like little aliens, right? I look like I have a skin suit on of like a normal person. I can put on clothes, but like, how do I make eye contact with somebody? I mean, I was as stereotypical homeschool kid as you could come. I didn't know how to talk to anybody. I didn't, so I had to assume this role of like pretending I was a certain person in order to mask and to look around. And I still do this. I'm still like, oh, okay, this is what we're supposed to be wearing. This is what the trend is. Okay, cool. This is how I fit in. And so I just knew if I somehow became educated, that I would find freedom in that because I had autonomy. And I fought because I wasn't educated. So I had to go to college, and I was on the dean's like probationary list for the whole time, which is mortifying for as a perfectionist wanting to like be perfect. But it's because I had to go to college to learn what math was and then retake the class to figure out how to use that math for genetics. And then I had to take genetics the third time to actually pass the class, so that way I could get my degree. And so you just got to do it. I mean, and nobody believed in me, nobody. And it got to the point where then I didn't talk to my family for 9 years. I had to cut them out of my life because I was raising a child and I didn't want her to be in that level of dysfunction. And so you got to be able to just walk that road, and it sucks, man. It sucks. But it gets better. And then all of a sudden, you start gravitating towards people that are supportive. You learn what kindness is. You learn how to not shy away from that, or to look at somebody and be like, why are you being nice? What do you want from me? Who are you going to turn me into? And so I think time really also helps. And like, we're talking 20 years, really. So that's for me.
I relate so hard to the whole reading what you used to write when you were religious. My God, I had a Bible verse every day. Makes me want to choke myself out. Anyway, questions. I know we got them. What questions do we have? I'll come up with the mic. Thoughts? Questions for one another?
I do have a question for, well, both of you, I guess, could answer it. What do you think the secular community can do to better support people who are still in high control cults? Let's call them what they are, cults.
Not trying to extract them out of their community. For me, when I talk to people and they hear about what I do, the first thing is, oh, we want to help. How do we help these women escape? And I'm like, to what? This dumpster fire? Are you kidding me? Like, it is so hard to like function. And I'm like, it's not all that in a bag of chips out here. The better question is how can we support them where they're at right now and create safety? And so I think learning that it's like we have to put our own, like, we know that they need to like get out, right? Or maybe not. I don't know. We're not the experts on them. They are. And so I think really truly supporting them where they're at, and not having an agenda, but being like, how can we keep you safe in this moment? And then that safety, how can we walk along with you through that and without any strings attached?
Yes. 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 Wonderful.
I think, AJ, to your question, people in cults, I think a lot of us who are on the outside, even those who have been there and get out, sometimes fail to realize is that these cults are these people's entire lives, entire social circles. Everything in their life revolves around the cult. So when I think back to what really started breaking me out into accepting more of the world, as it was called, and everything, was I think back to my first job, my first real job outside of any kind of cult-related things. My trainer in that job, on-the-job trainer, was a lesbian. And of course, I've been taught in my world that all lesbians hated men and were just wanting to set us up for failure so that they could rule the world or something. And I approached that with fear. I was like, I'm screwed. I'm going to fail. It doesn't matter what I do or how good a job I'm doing. She's going to fail me. But she took me under her wing and she trained me so well. She was tough, but fair. And she even told me at one point, she's like, I am invested in your success. She said, I want to see you succeed here because this job is important to me. And I want to make sure you can do it to the point that I am satisfied with my work and your work. And I said, that makes sense. And that was something that at that point, it planted like a little seed in my head that I never got this in my cult. I was set up for failure so many times in my cult. Like you said, you're always the problem. This was the first person in my adult life that ever told me, I'm here to help you. I'm invested in your success. And she never knew until like years later when I told her, I was like, when we had both like left our jobs, I said, you do realize that you were a huge part of my healing, right? And she's like, no. I was like, yeah. She was just being decent. And so all that to say, be there for people, like you said, with no strings attached, because their preconception of you needs to be shattered by your kindness.
Yes. 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 Right here.
Chad, when you told your dad, I'm out of here, what was his reaction?
It was loud. We were in the family double wide trailer. Yeah. We've all lived there. And he was stomping around the house. He was, I'll never forget, because this was the game he and Mom would play sometimes. Mom was over there on the couch sobbing, and he was like, look at what you're doing to your mother. And I looked at her and I said, Mom, that doesn't work anymore.
Oh,
I said,
bam.
yeah, you need to stop. And she immediately stopped. And I was like, oh my God, all these years, that's all I had to do.
Gentle parenting your parents.
But eventually, like, he was yelling, he was saying I was possessed by the devil or whatever. I had been reading him some verses trying to convince him that the KJV had taught us all wrong, King James Version of the Bible. And I was reading another translation, and he was stomping around saying, get that, devilish stuff out of my house. And I finally said, you know what? If you're not going to listen, I'm leaving. Call me when you can have a discussion like an adult. He called me later and left a message saying, son, okay, just don't ever talk about what you believe when you're under my roof. Now, he never reciprocated. He would always try to apologize whenever I came over. But yeah, that's pretty much how it ended. And that's unfortunately kind of where our relationship stagnated.
So kind of leading into that, my question is a two-parter. One, do you believe that people who are invested in these cults and these communities, can they show true unconditional love? And two, is it possible to maintain relationships with people who are still very much in these cults when we as family members have exited?
Oh, who's supposed to answer that? Because I have thoughts. The second part, how do we maintain? I think that it's not a blanket statement because it's individual, like as much as there can be individuality within this. So I see this working within the Amish and Mennonite communities, right? They're in it and they want to stay in it. And so I don't come in with an expectation. I try to be me as congruently as I can. And they respect that. But not everybody does. But that's okay. It's not for them. So I think the biggest thing is the focus needs to be on our own integrity and how we show up and how you show up for them. It may take them 10 years to realize that, oh, yeah, maybe she feels like a safe person. Maybe it takes 3 months. But neither of that has anything to do with how you show up. And it's hard. It's hard to show up when people hate you. It really is. I mean, I get that. And especially when it's family members and they're trying their dogma. And I think you can just say, I think this is a conversation that we can just, that waits until it feels better for both of us because it's emotionally charged. And just leave it at that.
I think there are different types of relationships, even with family. There are some where you have to learn where to draw the boundaries because sometimes they can be very toxic. And there are others that it is worth continuing to have these conversations. I have a really good example of one family member whom my husband and I both have conversations with about religion. And In the beginning, I will say it was a little tense. It wasn't very fun. But the more we had these conversations, the more we understood each other, even if we both had completely different beliefs. Um, I use Anthony Magnabosco's great epistemology method, where you just ask questions without judgment. You listen to the person, and you draw more questions based on their answers. And this person is actually here with us today. So I'm very proud of both of us for having this type of relationship and this type of conversations and continuing to make progress. So yeah, I think people can definitely have relationships with religious family.
And yeah, I'll just say that I think it is possible to repair those relationships. It takes work, it takes time, and it takes a lot of patience. But to those who are leaving and who are still healing in and of themselves, keep in mind it's not your duty by yourself to save those relationships. You're still healing. Make sure your oxygen mask is on before you put other people's on for them. So, yeah, make sure that you are safe before you do.
Okay, it's Jasper and Chad have touched on this topic a little briefly, where it comes to like maybe family psychology, mental health, dysfunctional kind of like aspects. And we, of course, all know how like the high control kind of culty religions bring that as well. So obviously that can like play on top of each other. Uh, do you have like any kind of like thoughts or experience trying to like separate that out and kind of like detangle it? Because like uh, for me personally, I'm trying to see how that might have caused, in my case, would have caused the religiosity, which would have caused like the further mental health struggles, which would, it was just kind of like a cycle. So I don't know if you guys know about like detangling.
I would just like to paraphrase back the question to make sure I understand. So you're saying that in situations where a lot of the harm may have come from mental health issues on the part of the people in the cult, or like your caregivers and such, how do you detangle the toxicity from what was truly a mental health issue that needs attention? Correct? Okay. Thoughts? Well, in my case, yes, there was a lot of undiagnosed mental health issues in my family. Trust me on that. I don't dare. I'm not an expert. I don't dare diagnose them for them, but they were there. And for me, like again, it was putting on my own oxygen mask first, because I had a lot of mental health issues too, especially nature and nurture. And once I had the tools to deal with my own things, then I could, approach and seriously, therapy, therapy, therapy. I worked with a therapist very hard to try to untangle, what was, just my brain misfiring and what were actually toxic traits that I was choosing to continue to follow, and then disentangle. So, for one, I needed medication. For the other, I needed to clean up my thinking. And yeah, I just say, like, you need help, and there are people who are qualified to help you do it. That was my thing.
And not a religious therapist either.
That part.
Say what? Secular Therapy Project, Recovering from Religion. Lots of wonderful organizations.
Okay, so I think like going back to creating that space for your own healing can be really hard when your family unit is really dysfunctional, and whether or not it's mental health. I can really relate to this of trying to understand the why, because if we can understand the why, then we can understand that we can control it. We can then put the pieces together and say, okay, because of A, B, C, this happened to me. And it makes it feel manageable when you grow up in a lot of chaos. At least it did for me. And so I couldn't find a therapist that could understand what I'd gone through, and I stopped. I did not go to therapy because I would end up having to educate the therapist on every single thing that was coming up, and it was exhausting. And I was just like, so I went into the psychology books and a lot of those things. So I really self-taught. And what I recognized is in that distance that I had to untangle myself from my family for 9 years. And I started looking at them as people instead of my parents. And it helped a little bit because I could see the patterns then and be like, oh, okay, so this was probably happening and this is why this happened. And it's really difficult because it's like there is that aspect where it makes sense. And what can happen though is when you do that is you can talk yourself out of the emotions and betrayal of that your family would do that to you. And that's what I experienced, where it's like really easy to just psychoanalyze and be like, oh yeah, well of course they would join this cult because they didn't have structure and they were looking for this and this. That doesn't mean that they didn't create a lot of harm in the process. So for anybody that is doing that, I think it's great. And don't bypass your own lived experience in that, trying to understand your parents.
Yes.
Make sure that you still honor your own healing
Yes.
for whatever fucked upness that you went through.
Yes. And just to kind of piggyback, I think something that a lot of people run into, which is really unfortunate and really horrible, is when they have known mental health issues and their family makes that the problem. Like, you're feeling this way because you're mentally ill. You know you're mentally ill. You literally take medicine. How are you not seeing this is the mental illness? We're not mentally ill. We don't have this issue. Two things can be true at once. You can have a mental illness and you can see the signs of an issue when there are one. So if you are somebody who struggles with mental illness and is also struggling with your faith, those two things do not have to go together. And if you really think about it, you might be harming your mental illness even more by continuing to be involved in some of these high control environments. So it's not the flex they think it is, you know? Also, I've never been more atheist than when I got subscribed ADHD medications. So it didn't work. I went from deconverting to deconverting and doing something about it. Because, you know, Adderall and all that. Any final thoughts? Final words?
Yeah, I wanted to add to something that Jasper said earlier about education. I think it's one of the most important things to help people come out of religion. For me, I learned to love. I sucked at science when I was in high school. Okay, but after coming out of religion, I became fascinated by it, and I think it's one of the things that helped me the most. Learning how biology and all of that works.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's one of the best ways to come out of religion.
And how do you know? Because that's the first thing they get rid of. That's the first thing. I had a religious mom come up to me once after a live conversation, and she said, "What were the first signs that you were doubting your faith?" And her daughter was standing right next to her, and I was like, "I know, you're asking me to try and so I just said, answer all of her questions and always let her research." And I said that in front of the daughter. I said, if she ever has a question, let her do research and let her come to her own conclusions. It's like, I'm not about to brainwash nobody today. So if our guests were interested in hearing more from you or seeing your work or following you anywhere on social media, where can they find additional work from you?
Thank you. I have a channel called Ways to Human, and I do content where I debunk religious beliefs with science.
What? Shocking. So,
I am primarily Arch Radish on TikTok, and if you're wondering, that's just Chad Harris mixed up. So yeah, I'm Arch Radish on TikTok. I've been on a little bit of a hiatus due to personal issues, but I will be starting up content again pretty soon. And you can probably find me on a lot of podcasts, half of which are probably Sydney's. So yeah.
yes.
Oh, and you bet Chad is gonna be on my next episode. You own it.
I got a lot of things because I got a lot of projects. So I have a podcast, the Plain People's Podcast, that covers, I believe, 40 stories. I stopped doing that to be able to record Sins of the Amish. You can watch Sins of the Amish on Peacock. And then I recently launched a Substack called the Plain People's Project. And it's taking you in real time as I investigate and go into the communities and try to solve the problem of this systemic abuse. And it highlights the women that are speaking out from within the communities and a lot of things like that. So you can support me there.
Yeah. And if anybody here has any additional questions or comments or feedback, and for whatever reason, maybe you're too shy or you got to get out of here, if you go to growingupfundiepodcast.com, scroll all the way to the bottom, any question you submit for them, I will send to them. So, or any comment or any feedback you have, just make sure you include your email so I can then provide the answer or any kind of response and feedback. But it's all the way at the bottom. On the mobile version, there might be a little bit of a gap before you go all the way to the bottom. But give it up for our guests today. Fantastic. Fantastic. Wonderful, wonderful.